Hello and welcome back to the Cave Escape podcast. I'm Ashton Goolsby.
And I'm Caleb Groves.
And we are here again with Mr. Greg Wilbur, the president of New College Franklin, one of my former professors, one of Caleb's current professors. And last time he spoke with us on the quadrivium, the last four of the 7 liberal arts, we talked with him about that. Today we wanted to go over why would we study these things? Why are the 7 arts important, specifically the last 4? So again, the first 3 is the trivium, the grammar, the logic, and then the rhetoric. And then the last 4, the quadrivium, we have arithmetic, geometry, harmonia or music, and cosmology or astronomy. And just kind of looking at why are these important things to learn? A lot of times now, I know, just from back working the drive-thru in college, people ask me where I was going, asking why would I go to a school that studies these things? Why would these arts, why are they important? They don't necessarily point me toward any type of specific career,
right?
But why are they themselves important to study?
Mm-hmm. Once again, thank you for having me back on. Appreciate that. It goes back to, I think, more fundamentally, what is important, and not just from a job perspective, but a human perspective of what has God made you to be and do. And I think in a very real sense, and here St. Victor talks about this in his work, that the 7 liberal arts are essentially direct answers to pushing back effects of the fall.
Interesting.
And so what we're trying to accomplish, what we're thinking about in terms of our understanding, growing an understanding of the world that God has made, is seeking justice, seeking shalom, seeking the restoration of the way that things were meant to be. And the liberal arts, the classical 7 liberal arts, are a way to go about that.
Wow. And
to think about that and how to move that in positive directions, our own understanding and our way in which we relate to one another. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, if our ultimate sense of why do we exist, why has God made us, what does our telos, in terms of why this life, part of that is to be like Adam, part of that is to be like Christ. Mm-hmm. in terms of seeking redemption, seeking restoration, and reconciliation of all things. And so that's why I think it's important. I know from a it seems, quote, a more practical sense, how are you going to make a living? I think ultimately, in the greatest practical sense, that's secondary to what our primary calling should be.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds great, philosophically and so forth. Like, oh yes. Yeah. But how am I going to pay the bills? Part of what the arts are getting at too is it is the foundation then for other aspects of learning. Mm. Historically, it would then be where you then studied medicine or law or philosophy or theology. This was kind of the core upon which the other studies were based. And the reason of that is, and I think from the, if you want to get kind of the practical answer in terms of the world in which we live, working through the 7 liberal arts enables you to adapt, enables you to be able to think through complex ideas, enables you to be able to communicate, whether in writing or with other people, and to do so on all sorts of different levels. I mean, I think it's not just the ivory tower academic kind of elitist approach. It really, truly, to be able to talk to anybody at any level about anything, and to be able to learn and to adapt and to process. And I think, even in the context of, what businesses are looking for, they need somebody who can communicate well, and they need somebody who can adapt to things which are ever changing. And the idea of studying a narrow degree or having an advanced degree in a very narrow concept, with a doctorate or PhD, you know a lot about one kind of sliver.
Yeah,
right.
But with the 7 liberal arts, you see how those things interconnect.
That's a problem my dad's seen. He's a digital content manager, and they'll hire writing interns over the summer to write. They're English majors. They'll hire them, I think, junior or senior year to come write for them. And he said they can't write more than a Twitter post. He said everything they write has to be rewritten. But they're English majors.
Right.
They should know how to write.
Yeah.
And he said I would rather have somebody competent in there, I don't care what their credentials are, than an English major that can't write a basic sentence.
Right. Well, I think James Shaw talks about in his book, The Order of Things, that you can't know anything without knowing everything, because everything is interrelated. And to isolate anything unto itself is you're cutting off what it means and how it connects to everything else. He also says that shouldn't keep you from actually learning what you can, because you can't learn everything unless you're God. That's in the total interrelation of how all these things interplay with one another. But to at least keep open the door that these things do have connections. There are connecting points. There are ways in which they interrelate, and all sorts of unexpected ways that we wouldn't even think about until you actually get into them. That allows for that depth of understanding, of drawing connections, of being able to do more than just one thing that you've been trained to do. And that's, I think, gives a much broader sense of what it means to be human. I mean, they're the liberal arts because they're the liberating arts. It's those things which enable us to be free, to be who God has made us to be. And that's why they are constructed in that way.
Interesting. So we all need to be Renaissance men then?
No. See, I don't personally. I don't particularly like that idea, because I think the idea of a Renaissance man was somebody who's good at everything,
right?
As opposed to, I think, more of a Christian concept of leaning into the things in which God has gifted you. Recognizing that the gifts that he's given you are for the sake of others, but also acknowledging where you have weaknesses, and that God has given gifts to other people to match where those weaknesses are in your life. And because of that, you don't have to spend all this time to shore up these weaknesses I don't know much about investing. I could spend a lot of time to learn about investing. Or I could go to somebody who does that all the time, and that's what they do, and that's what they're gifted at.
Right.
And who is going to know a lot more than I am by any sort of study that I can do. Same thing with accounting. I can use accounting software. I don't have to do it all myself. I don't have to. I don't have to be good at all these things. I can acknowledge this is an area in which I need someone's help, and let them use the gifts that God has given them, and not steal literally from the. I think in the Westminster Catechism talks about it in this kind of language, steal from them the opportunity to use the giftings and callings that God has given them, by trying to take that away from them.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that. Because I often hear people try to talk about. I remember, like in high school, hearing people talk about classical education being you're like a Renaissance man. You can now go out and do everything. But then hearing you explain it, specifically like student weekends and things, it was always refreshing to come back and hear you say the acknowledgement of you study everything, but the acknowledgement of there's going to be things that you're good at, and there's some things you're not good at, and it's wrong to deprive somebody who's better at something else than you the opportunity to use the gifts they've been given, but also to help you. Because you're helping them by letting them help you with what they're good at.
Right. And the gifts that we've been given are not for our sake anyway. They're to give to others because other people need them. Yeah. But it also enables you too in relationship with one another. We talk about in the classroom that you don't have to be the person that always has the right answer.
Right.
And in fact, you shouldn't be. And that and to truly, as Bonhoeffer talks about the ministry of listening. Being able to actually listen to others, and to hear what they're saying, and to hear what they're not saying, and the questions beneath the questions, and to be able to engage in that way, and to know that you're not always going to be the life of the party. Somebody else may be that person. That's their role. Well, what's your role? And instead of being envious of that or trying to be somebody you're not, what does it mean to be comfortable and content? Use a good scriptural word there, to be content in who God has made you, and to serve and love others from that place, and not try to strive after being something or somebody you're not, but to appreciate those in others. And I think that ultimately, that eliminates the idea of jealousy. That eliminates the ability to serve one another, and to do so graciously. Gratitude is an important part of that. I think it's a lot easier to weep with those who weep than it is to rejoice with those who rejoice. Because if you weep with somebody who weeps, you can be kind and empathetic, and you look good. Right?
Makes sense.
Yeah. But to rejoice with somebody because they have done a good thing, even if it meant that you came in second and they came in first, is hard. But it's rejoicing the thing itself and in their accomplishment as something separate from your own sense of ego, your own sense of trying to get ahead or be perceived in a particular way.
It's a hard one to. That's why a hard one to teach to 9-year-olds.
Yes, it is. I mean, I think yes. And and I'm sure people are out there thinking, or you're maybe thinking, boy, we've gotten a far cry away from the quadrivium at this point. I don't think so. I really believe that the purpose of the quadrivium is training and education in virtue. And I know virtue is kind of a buzzword these days in educational circles in terms of we train for virtue, and I'm not sure what the curriculum looks like for that, in terms of what everybody kind of means by that. And it sounds good, and it's important, because I think it is, you're talking about the aspect of not just a curricular decision, but actually what it means to be more like Christ, to grow, to be more into the image of Christ. But I think that's part of what, kind of intuitively, instinctually, I think that the quadrivium was about. And that's a little harder to put your finger on, but I think that's, when you see then, you're talking again about the invisible attributes of God and his nature and character from Romans 1, and how that's revealed in the things that he has made, and how the quadrivium kind of gets at that directly, then you're engaged in a theological pursuit in which you're connecting these things and understanding these things, not slapping a Bible verse on it, but the inherent richness and wonder and awe and gratitude of it is of who God is and what he has made, and the fact that he has placed you in this particular time, in this particular place, for particular reasons, and that is awe-inspiring, and the gratitude and the graciousness which should flow from that gives a lot of different perspective in terms of your own role or lack of role, and the humility of that, and what it means to serve others, and what it means to give your life away and to daily take up your cross. And so it's I think that's kind of the fullness and the point of where all of this leads. I also think too, in the recovery of the quadrivium, I mean, I think the question that everyone wants to know is what's it for? I mean, even kind of in the sense of the recovery of it, it's like, okay, what were they after? How did they get there? What has changed that we can jettison, and what do we need to keep? What are the things that we can only get at through the quadrivium in some sort of historic recovery? I mean, these are kind of the questions that people kind of ask. And I think there's a point to those questions. I'm not sure those are all the right questions to ask. I think there are things to consider, certainly, but it's also a rather utilitarian approach, and it's also taking an analytical approach. I mean, part of the problem of analyzing everything is that you're looking at it from the outside.
Yeah.
And I don't think really anybody's in a position to sit back and look at the quadrivium, me included, to look back at the quadrivium and say, oh, the quadrivium is for this. And I can see how this here develops students in this particular way, and here's how we should go about this. Because we've not been educated through the quadrivium. And I think it's going to take time. I think the students who are part of the early recovery of the quadrivium are going to have a deeper and greater understanding, and they can push the conversation forward and continue to push the conversation forward to subsequent revisions and understanding over a couple of generations of students to really fully understand why and how. I think we can intuit a lot of that. We can see how some of that works. We can see experientially and objectively some of those connections. But to truly inhabit the quadrivium, we would have had to be educated thoroughly in the 7 liberal arts from early on, and we haven't been, and so we just need to acknowledge that, and then move forward as best we can, such that those who take up that mantle, thank you, gentlemen, can push that forward to another generation of students, and to continue to the fullness of what that should and could be as we get farther down the road.
So one thing I did want to come back to, which when we showed you the notes for the last episode, you kind of critiqued the way we had originally put the trivium and the quadrivium together. So we had said, which we got from reading The Lost Tools of Learning, where I got that idea when I put it in there, was the first three are kind of subservient to the other four. And since you've got the other three, and the other three are to get you to the four.
Mm-hmm.
And that we also said that with the Dorothy Sayers, it lines up with the childhood stages of development. You offered us a critique of that way of looking at it. Could you kind of repeat that again?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think there's Dorothy Sayers is helpful, and I think there's a lot that we can be grateful for in terms of that particular essay. At the same time, she kind of completely dismisses the quadrivium and kind of sets it aside. And I think she's also working within a unique definition of the trivium that has been kind of latched onto in various ways. I know from my own experience in teaching, homeschooling my daughter, if we had waited for 5 or 6 years through the whole parrot stage of just having her memorize things to answer all of her questions about why, I think she would have been completely frustrated. I mean, because immediately she was beginning wanting to make connections and to understand things. And so, in the midst of introducing new ideas and aspects of knowledge and memorizing things, we try to draw those connections to give a greater sense of why this is important. She stumbled in math because she wanted to know why. She just didn't want to memorize facts. She wanted to understand how this connected in particular ways. And I think those are very valid questions. Of course, it was easier, in homeschooling one that it would be a larger class,
Right.
to answer all those questions. You got to, you have material you have to get through. But there's it's not such a clean dividing line. And I think too, when you look at the trivium in terms of stages, how far does that go? Are we saying that after the rhetoric stage, you now hit the arithmetic stage? Followed by the geometry stage, or is that just something that is kind of trivium, particular understanding of the trivium? Like I said, I would argue with that. I think there have been several articles and people kind of pushing back on some of those ideas. Grateful for the conversations that started, but not being slavish to strict ideas of learning stages. And seeing the integration of those things in a more holistic way. I think I used the analogy last week with the quadrivium is almost looking three-dimensionally. You can enter into any point, and you can see that almost like a three-dimensional shape that you're holding and moving around different facets. I think the same is true with regards to the 7-level arts. I mean, you're entering into this understanding, this knowledge, this wisdom through these different portals, and they're not just singularities. I mean, there's a connecting point, and there's when you how we represent knowledge is kind of fascinating. And there's a series of 3 books, and I can't remember the author right now. One is representing knowledge via circles. One is representing knowledge via trees. And the other one is more of an integrated sense. And the idea that, using historic examples, that some trying to outline some particular things makes more sense to show them in circles. Some make more sense to show them as branches of a tree. Other things have all these interconnections that you draw lines between. And we've become such linear thinkers, I think, that we see things as a list, and we automatically put those in some sort of hierarchy. And so whether that's the top of the list is the most important, or the bottom list is the most important. I think I said last week as well, we don't see the first 10 numbers as as a collection of numbers that have inherent qualities. We see them as a succession of numbers. And while some things do move one to the other, you know, instead of seeing those, instead of seeing that as a succession, but seeing that as a collection, I think makes a big difference. And so, you know, the difference would be, well, you start with grammar, and then you move through this list,
Right.
as opposed to how all these things interplay. I mean, I think, you know, and we even within schools or movements or so forth that are very well, that are more strict with regards to ages and stages type of thing, you still wind up teaching math and music and science on a young level. So it's not just that these are all set aside for a later time. What generally gets set aside is teaching those from a truly classical perspective. And so we use more we use math curriculums or science curriculums that and some are good in their ways, or you know, some are from Christian resources, and so they have, you know, things that are integrated within the content, but they're not really thinking about those arts from a holistic, quadrivial, liberal arts kind of perspective.
That is one thing I'll say I've noticed. Because one of the subjects I got halfway through the year last year got caught into. I had to teach science, and one thing I noticed with the curriculum we've been using is it's got I think it was last time you described it as almost like a simplistic way of looking at it. The sun rises and it's beautiful, therefore God is beautiful. It gives them those kinds of things, but not necessarily showing them kind of from a more quadrivium based, this is what makes this beautiful. The beauty is it works and it reflects God in these other ways. And that was one thing specifically I tried to pull the astronomy in as we spent a quarter on that, but we really heavily that we don't really use their book. And I found most of the sources I'm drawing off of are the ones that we use in cosmology. Like I love the H.A. Ray book. We pull that out, but kind of taking them through that, and it was funny because it's one of those things that a lot of times I feel like people sometimes say, oh, it's too much for a kid that young, that they enjoyed it in spite of most of them said, well, we've done this before, we don't want to do it again, but seeing it that way, that they even themselves said, we haven't seen it this way, this is exciting. It was exciting to them to see it that way. So I feel like sometimes we even discount what little kids are capable of understanding and enjoying.
Right.
We think we have to dumb it down for them somehow, make it basic. But as you were even saying with math, I've had students ask, particularly mathematically gifted students ask, why do I have to learn to divide this number according to this rule? And then I've had to wrestle, do I spend the time explaining to them, in a year or two you're going to move on to this? And I find if I do that, they not only understand it better, but they enjoy it and they're more willing to do it because they see it relating.
Yeah. Well, and you know, one of the first things we see God doing is division. In Genesis 1.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, what do we do with that? I mean, yeah, it's a whole other thing. Yeah, well, yeah. I think, you know, when you start thinking about, you know, the sun rises is majestic, like all the implications of that, with regards to the Earth spinning and orbiting, and the sun spinning and orbiting, and where we are in relationship to the sun in terms of not freezing or burning up, and where the tilt of the Earth is at that particular season, and you know, all those types of things, all those elements that you know, we take the sunrise for granted, but it's an amazing thing, and even you know, even the aspect of calling it a sunrise has a geocentric nature to it.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing the sun doesn't rise, the sun is there. You know, the Earth is moved. That's why. But you know, and that's part of the beauty of this too. That there are different ways and understandings of how to approach things which are true but seem to be incongruent. So, for example, from a geocentric point of view, the Earth being the center of the solar system. And we see, medieval, we see the spheres related to the Earth in particular ways, including the moon and the sun and the visible planets, and the way the stars move from our perspective of where we are. We know that not to be scientifically how it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But from a philosophical or theological view, does the Earth serve the sun, or does the sun serve the Earth?
Mm-hmm.
Did God create the sun to serve the Earth, which is the habitation of His image bearers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when you see the truth of that from the perspective of how that shows up in literature, how that shows up in symbolism, this aspect of the sun rising, as you just mentioned, the sun rising in the east, all the implications that has with regards to the imagery and the symbolism of Christ. These things are all inherent together. Now, does the Earth actually rotate around the sun? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But from our perspective and how we see that, and how the sun serves how the outer planets serve us from keeping us from being bombarded by asteroids, how the other planets and their gravitational pulls keeps us in our particular orbit that allows for life on Earth. How the constellations move through the various seasons. I mean, all those things are have the scientific explanation truth, but also they have the philosophical, theological truth as well.
Mm-hmm.
And those aren't combative. I mean, I think you can't really understand just the scientific without understanding the philosophical and the theological. But to understand the theological and the philosophical, you also need to understand how that's actually working.
Right. Yeah. So kind of from there too, the understanding of the inner working of everything. We're also talking some kind of separately, but then also with you a little before too. On you said there's a little debate of is cosmology, is that kind of, I guess for lack of a better term, the end point, or the
culmination,
the culmination,
final
I guess,
discipline
of the other disciplines, or is it harmony? You said there's kind of a case, and I realize I'm probably not using the best wording on that, but you said there's a case that can be made. It could be harmonia rather than cosmology. That is kind of a culmination of the other ones.
Yeah, different medieval sources have those listed in different orders, and so it's a long-standing argument. And I think part of it is there's so much overlap as well. I mean, you can't talk about the great dance in cosmology without talking about music. Mm-hmm. What are you dancing to? But the aspect of music, harmonia, as a representation of an understanding of order. I mean, medieval composers, musicians, saw their role as reflecting the order of the cosmos and then sustaining the order of the cosmos through the music that they were creating. And so there's a very much connection of music is interrelated to and interlaced with the cosmos. And so in some ways it doesn't matter. I think, you can get at both of those in particular ways. I mean, we have the discussion every year with should this concept be taught in cosmology or should this concept be taught in harmonia? Because it could legitimately be taught in either one.
Wow.
So how, where does this most naturally fall with regards to the other things that we're covering in particular course? So I mean, there's a reason for that. I think there is a sense though in which harmony, especially as we talked about last time, justice, shalom, is an overarching concept that connects all of the quadrivium, including cosmology. And so from that perspective, it makes sense. I think when Luther talks about the fact of that music is next to theology, I think what he's potentially talking about is that music as the fourth quadrivial art is the one next below theology. So after studying music, then you move into theology. So I think he would have sided with the idea of music being the fourth. And you look at his theology and his writings, and he's talks so much about music and the importance of music and how ministers of the gospel should be able to sing. That's just as important as anything else. And so there is that interconnection there as well. All creation sings. I mean, we see again and again in the Psalms. The Psalm 19 with how creation displays the glory of God without words, but day by day. There's that interconnection there of the cosmological and the musical. So I think ultimately it doesn't necessarily matter in one or the other. I think what concerns me more than anything as a musician is how far away from our understanding of music we've gotten. And so whether it comes third or fourth, what we think about what that entails is so far removed from what the early church and the medievals or the ancients would have thought, that it's almost unrecognizable. And I think that's more that's even more of greater significance. I mean, when you think about what most, I have 2 degrees in music. This is what I was taught. This is how I was taught in terms of the kind of the standard way. You think about music as music appreciation, music history, music theory, and not much more than that. And in particular ways, I mean, music history was basically. Yes, we talked very briefly about Boethius and the music of the spheres. So that was a check mark in my head of like, I want to know more about that. We never did learn any more about that. But music history was to get to the symphony. That's the apex and the high point of music history. But when you think about music appreciation programs or what most kids are taught if they're taught music at all, it is post-Enlightenment, secular, instrumental music written for the concert stage.
Yeah. Prior
to 1,500 years worth of music before that, which was primarily liturgical, vocal, written for a worship aesthetic, and written with regards to the theological life of the believer. And that's a whole different approach and a whole different understanding of what music is and what it's for. And I think even when we give a nod to music, that it's a nod to a more of a post-Enlightenment kind of view. We don't look at the idea of can you say that music is moral or immoral? I'm talking about music without words. Can you talk about music as being good, ethically good? Can you talk about music as being true? We relegate the idea of music primarily to beauty,
right?
Which is something we don't do almost with anything else. I mean. But we don't think about that. And I think part of that is because we don't know how to talk about music anymore from a musical sense. And so we talk about it from an aesthetic sense, which then leads into a whole subjective conversation about what do you like versus what do I like. What do you self-identify as in terms of your musical choices, and what do I self-identify as in my musical choices? Because it gets that personal.
Yeah.
If I criticize a musician you don't like, it's almost as if I've criticized you.
Yeah.
You take it personally. I mean, not you personally, but one takes it personally.
Yes.
Yeah. Caleb is particularly personal about this. But it's so much inherent a part of our identity that we don't have that separated in terms of what's an objective sense of what music is for, and what does it tell us. And that's part of what got me interested in the quadrivium to begin with, specifically with regards to music as a musician, and specifically with regards to what does that mean. With worship, what does that entail with regards to the music that we utilize in worship services? So all those things have been interrelated for me for years, and then seeing how those things interconnect and pursuing the other quadrivial arts as a holistic approach.
Not to go on too much of a rabbit trail, but you were talking recently about when I sat on the Harmonia a few weeks ago. You were talking about Handel's Messiah, how it was originally meant to be performed versus how we perform it now, where it's this big concert piece. And I actually got the opportunity, I think it was 2 weeks ago, to go to the Skirmerhorn with my aunt. Had an extra ticket, and I went and saw. I'd never seen Handel's Messiah live, but I told my dad afterwards. I loved the ending. I think was my favorite. That whole third section, but I said it hit me because I believe the words they're singing are true and they're beautiful. I was even telling Caleb, I said there's some things I caught he did in there with. It's like some brief moments of counterpoint, or it almost looked like the cellos and violins were fighting at one point. Just the bow movements. I thought it was beautiful. But the thing that hit me afterwards was that if it's for these people, it's most likely more of the opportunity to say they performed this well-known piece, but how many of them actually believed the words that they were listening to or understood the gravitas of what Handel had put to music. So yeah, having the difference of even Handel, the time he wrote it to the time now, it's a concert piece to be performed at Christmas and Easter
in a concert hall. Yeah,
it's a big shift.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and that's not to dismiss all of that. I mean, there's still. I mean, that's a whole other long conversation. But but I mean, when you think about what the implications are, and with regards to how a piece like that gets performed and why, as opposed to its intent, or look at Bach's cantatas or other works that have a liturgical purpose, and would have been performed in a much different kind of way, that less showy, less less showy, and more of more to get to the heart of the text, because I mean that was Handel's intent, not to have a bunch of notes, but to actually convey the gospel words that are part of the libretto.
So that kind of tying that a little bit into, we talked a little bit in the first episode. Just mentioned we're talking about why we're called the Cave Escape, where we picked that name, kind of the allegory of Plato's cave. It kind of, you escape, you see the light of philosophy, and then you go back and you can't return back, and people fight you to come with you. But we were talking then about the idea of what I've always heard it called the great conversation. Could you kind of explain to us a little more what kind of is that? We briefly just mentioned that it was a thing. And what is that idea?
Right, I think there are several terms that get thrown around. The great books is one of them, which is more associated with Mortimer Adler and what his collection of the great books. And there's some pros and cons to that. The great conversation, I think, is a better term, or even the great questions. But the idea that, especially with regard, if you use the nomenclature of the great questions, these are significant questions that people have been wrestling with forever, for as long as there have been people, and their writings, in their art, in their philosophy, and as Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. And so even recognizing new philosophers that come out, it's really just a recapitulation of an idea that somebody else had already articulated maybe centuries before. But the idea that these writings, these works, these books, these stories, these philosophies, these works of art are in conversation with one another, and that there's a foundation on which they're building, and that there's you can trace ideas, and you can trace the development of ideas, and you can trace references and concepts, and that's this is a beautiful thing to see, and then to enter into that, and it's there's a modern, postmodern, whatever era we're in right now. I lose track of what we're supposed to be, but
right.
I don't think originality is a biblical concept. I mean, and I think we have this, especially artistically, but even with regards to thought, I mean, that's the whole, basically that's the whole idea in higher academia as well. You have to have an original thought to do a dissertation. But the idea of being original is meaning that you've got to do something that nobody else has done. Or in the arts, it means that it is distinctly unique.
Right.
Which means that you're setting aside or ignoring or trampling on everything that has come before, and for the sake of novelty. It's something. I mean, a lot of modern art, or even aspects of modern fiction, it's not so much that the work is inherently good within itself; it's that you're the first one to do it.
Yeah.
If I were to, famously, Duchamp did, submitted a urinal as a work of art to a museum. He got away with it because it was him. If I went to a museum and tried to do that, no one would want it. You know, and so it's not you can't duplicate that. You can't duplicate that. I mean, think of the difference between when God's talking to Moses about the construction of the tabernacle, and that part of the gift to Bezalel and Aholiab is the gift of teaching, to pass on the things that they know, the skills that they have know, so that other people can do it. And so what you have is this beautiful long lineage of craftsmanship, or of reference to other works, or this conversation that happens within the arts or within philosophy. You know, you're responding to things or to questions or ideas that you're wrestling with from what's gone on before, but you're not doing it in isolation. I think that's where most people get into a lot of intellectual difficulties, is that they are not doing this in conversation, either with the conversation of the past, of what's already been written, or with conversation with others. And you don't have those checkpoints, you don't have those, you know, those guidelines to say, yeah, that's an interesting thought. It's been tried and rejected for all of these reasons. You know, but it's very understandable why you would get there, and not to dismiss it out of hand. I mean, that's part of the beauty of learning conversation. It's not just here are the things you need to go, A, B, C, D, and now give that back to me on a test. But like, actually, let's wrestle through these ideas. And like, you know, okay, that's an interesting idea. What are the implications of that? You know, what did other people in the past have to say about that? What other conversations is that idea in relationship to? And that's kind of the beauty of the fullness of that. Now, you know, that has to be done well. That has to be cultivated well. And there are ways in which that's done better than others. But the idea of that, of entering into a long-standing tradition and opportunity of discourse, is a beautiful thing, I think.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you again for coming on and talking with us these
Absolutely.
Past 2 times. Thank you all for listening. Tune in next week. We'll have more for you then. Till then, take care.